this says control group and the out of control group. Jose is probably not in on this, but he would be somebody who in general is pretty controlled. And I would be somebody who's a little out of control. Now, what I mean by experimentation, if you look it up in the dictionary, there's sorts of two definitions. One is the process of performing a scientific procedure to determine something, and the other is the action or process of trying out new ideas, methods, or activities. And what I mean by this is both of them. And when I experiment, I try really hard to get outside of the lab and to do field experimentation. There's some brilliant quotes. Okay, well, maybe not brilliant, but this is mine. It's called Do More Experimentation. If you want to truly understand something, try to change it. I love fool experiments. I'm always making them. And today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. So there are some downsides to doing field experiments. Research is so unpredictable. There are periods where nothing works and all your experiments are a disaster and all the hypotheses are wrong. We can say that about everything, about all types of research. There are depressing periods when nothing appears to be happening, but whenever anything is happening, it was just fun to do these experiments. Experiments never err. It's only your judgments that err by promising themselves effects that are not caused by your experiments. Now, I know most of you probably know the benefits, the advantages and the disadvantages of experiments. What I'm here to tell you is that for the disadvantages, we can get rid of a lot of these things. We don't have to do them in labs. We can use samples that are representative. My studies did not cost a lot of money to do. We can focus on the present. We can focus on the past as well, and we can avoid the ethical problems. In my studies, what I tend to do is have a methodological recipe for doing a field study in the lab that is an experimental nature, or I do something else, which is I get preliminary data from the field. So for instance, I might find out from cancer survivors or people who have cancer and in the workplace, I say, what are the issues that you're actually facing? So I'm working with real people in organizations. And then I take that data and do a follow-up to try to think of what are the causal mechanisms that can explain things. And oftentimes I do that in the lab. So what I often do, and my recipe for having some success in publishing, is to pair an experimental data with some data in the field, or I do a field experiment. And I focus really hard on trying to identify the theoretical mechanisms and on pairing those published entities. I'm guessing that's close. Am I close, Craig? 2 minutes. Well, I'm finished. So I guess the next person gets 2 minutes, or I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Mikki. All right, let's open that up for questions. Mikki, if you have access to your chat, if you click on the chat button, you'll see.
Yes.
See the questions will appear. I'll keep an eye on those as well, but
okay.
Feel free to answer whatever ones you think are most interesting. So everybody, have at it.
I like the first one I see, which is good point. Oh, on my ethics slide. The one with the elephant? Can you go into more depth on your ethics slide? So let me just say, what are the ethical issues? Okay, so when you're going into organizations, when you're going into real organizations to collect data, one of the problems for me is it's discrimination that I'm interested in. So if I go into Coca-Cola and I say, I want to collect data from Coca-Cola, I want to see if Coca-Cola is discriminating. That's really, Coca-Cola doesn't want me anywhere near them because all of that data is discoverable. So if I find evidence for discrimination, then they can take it to court and say, here's research evidence, here's empirical data that shows that they discriminated. And that's true for some other, think if you were finding like counter work productive behaviors, or you were doing trust in organizations. So there's some things that are sensitive topics and it's hard to get access for an ethical standpoint and for a business standpoint of that data. The other thing that's ethical that I try to say is some of the research I do, you might go, well, how in the world can you go into these actual stores and apply for jobs? You know, maybe that's unethical. And what we made sure we did is if you think at all that you're doing anything that might be unethical, go through your lawyers, talk to other people who have done the research, make sure, like in our case, they couldn't misrepresent themselves. They actually could take the job. One of the students, actually, we had students in some of the studies, and one of the students took a job. So you have to make sure that you're not breaking any laws. Here's another ethical consideration. When we were wearing the obesity prosthetics, we had an individual who was wearing the obesity prosthetic. And at first I thought we were doing it on men, and I used the same female obesity prosthetic on men, and that didn't work. Men carry weight very differently. So in the pre-testing, when I was doing this in a shopping mall, a security officer came up to one of my students and he said, you know, I know that you're wearing a costume. And that's terrible. I mean, that's terrible. That's an ethical issue too, because you don't want people to think that you're like lying or deceiving them in a way that is like for something that, you know, is making fun of them or doing something like that. So we had to go back and reconstruct the prosthetics so that they were very, very believable. How do you come up with operationalizing your variable? Is the literature clear enough on how to operationalize these in the field? So with that, let me just say, if I didn't clarify the ethical question, please write back again and I can try to re-clarify it too. So operationalizing your variables is really important. So let's see, for the gay and proud study, what we did was we were interested in looking at formal discrimination versus interpersonal discrimination. And for that, what we said is formal discrimination would be if they don't hire you, if they don't let you apply for a job because we know that the jobs were posted. And when we first did this study didn't have online applications, so you'd actually have to go into the place and apply. So if you're not able to fill out an application, we knew that they were like not allowing the people to apply. And even if they actually asked, do you have any jobs available? And so we knew that they had jobs available. So that was sort of a formal discrimination. We weren't interested in the formal discrimination so much as this idea of interpersonal discrimination. And it's this idea of this more subtle type of discrimination, like my eye contact, how much I frown at you, how friendly I am to you. And we operationalized that with the audio tapes that we got in most of the interactions that I do. And essentially what we did is we have coders and the observers or the subjects themselves. So in some cases, there are observers that go in and watch the interaction and make ratings of that. And what we do is have every person who's in the interaction, except the store employee, fill out ratings of how friendly was the individual to you. How much did they terminate the interaction sooner than you had anticipated? How helpful were they? How much smiling did they do? Now, when we have observers, they can do it. When we have the Confederates, the people wearing the prosthetics, they can do it. When we have people listening to the audio tapes, they don't know that there's any difference between the different conditions. They're just listening to a whole bunch of tapes. They have no idea that some people are pregnant or obese or gay, ostensibly. And so what they're doing is they're rating these same characteristics to see if there are differences across the different conditions on rudeness. Obviously, they can't do smiling and eye contact, but they look at rudeness, friendliness, hostility. And so we're interested in those sorts of interpersonal types of discrimination. And in all of the studies that I showed you, we don't necessarily see the formal discrimination, but we see the operationalization of this more subtle discrimination. which is kind of interesting because people have the wherewithal to say, okay, I'm not going to formally discriminate, but what we see is they're interpersonally discriminating, and that has a lot of implications because people understand that they are targets of interpersonal discrimination. I hope that makes sense. Again, if that doesn't, please clarify. How would you confirm the reliability of the data collected? Sometimes when they say vary depends on people's feelings, would you solve issues by incorporating the surrounding condition in the experimental design? Okay, so what we do there is when we go into stores, we're only going into one store. We're only going into a store once. So for the series of studies that I talked about, we might go into Victoria's Secret, but only once. And then we go into the Gap, and then we go into a bunch of other stores. So it is the case that some of the data, people's feelings may depend on who is, being the person who's servicing you or who's asking the questions. What we do in the hiring paradigm is we say, can we talk to somebody who has the capability of hiring? Can we talk to a manager? So we know that when we go into 250 different stores, we're talking to 250 different managers. So we hope that we have some people who are feeling positive and some people who are feeling less positive, and that becomes that's not systematic error. We also collect the reliability of the data because, as I told you, sometimes we have observers. So we look at the observer perspective, we look at the target perspective, and then we look at the independent coders who are just listening to the audio tapes. And when all of those three perspectives converge, as they have done in our studies, then we have a pretty good sense that, yes, this person is experiencing interpersonal discrimination. We also have our independent raters and our observers code the Confederates as well, the people who are wearing prosthetics, because we don't want them to say, oh, I'm obese, so obviously I'm going to be treated negatively, and for them to enact the behavior in an experimental bias sort of way. So if you think about the Gay and Proud study, what we did there is people didn't know what hat they had on. So there's no way they could have had experimenter bias. In the other studies, we make sure for the reliability because what we're doing is looking across the different perspectives, and we're trying to make sure that it's not the Confederate and the Confederate is acting consistently. If I didn't answer that again, please write back. Randomized experiments, although the best way forward, but it's often difficult to implement. Do you have any recommendations for second best options for novel methods when experimentation is not possible? Okay, so yes, but here's what I do, is experimentation is always possible in the lab. So what I do, again, is there are just some things that are really hard to do. So I'm trying to think of a study I'm doing right now. I'm doing a study on sleep and how sleep deprivation increases discrimination. And so the first thing we're interested in doing is just getting an M-Turk sample and saying, if you don't get enough sleep, and then how much sleep have you gotten in the last few days? And then here's some discrimination tasks to see if those link up. So that's not an experiment, it's just a correlational study. And of course, as IO, as researchers, we often get correlational data. And so I think that's a great way to start. So for me, I love that. I love the correlational because it's real data, but it leaves you questioning, well, what's exactly the mechanism, or how do we know for sure? So what I like to do is take that data as the step one and then say, okay, now let's see if this is happening in the lab and what we can do to change it up. As one of the quotes said, I think it was Kurt Lewin, if you want to understand something, change it. So I love that manipulation. So my sort of belief is it's really hard for me to believe that you can't somehow use in some context an experiment. Now, do I think that studies are credible without experiments? Oh my goodness, yes. And some people are just afraid. They're afraid to, or they think, that's too much. I'm nervous about doing all that. you know, try a 2x2 out in the field and see what you come up with. It's just, it's more fun. Well, I think it's fun. It's real. You feel like you really understand things in ways you don't often understand them if you're just looking at archival data or you're looking at, you know, a lab. So I'd just say start small and try. But yes, the second best thing is to do whatever you've done and get with, you know, the topic at hand as close as you can with actual people. I was trained as a social psychologist. And one of the things I learned very early on is that social psychologists, to my great depression, were studying pencil and paper behavior, not like what happens when you actually get face to face with people. And so it excites me when I think about being an IO psychologist and using those tools that I used very early on.
So we might start maybe just the last question. Smeeta's is there. What would be an acceptable sample size for a field experiment?
Okay, so the same thing you do with everything else, which is do a power analysis and see what you come up with. You know, you go to the literature, see what's been done in field experiments that are close to your area. If there's not, you can look at mine. You know, it really depends. What I'd say, you know, we kind of have this rule of thumb without doing a power analysis that it's 20 per condition. And what I say is if it's 20 per condition, if your power analysis tells you 20 per condition, then do 30 per condition, because when you do field experiments, they're real live people. And sometimes they say things that you're like, oh, now that befuddles me. Okay, we didn't practice that. It leaves you needing some more subjects, perhaps, but you don't have to do your full design either. You can do the most interesting aspects of it and use your subjects really carefully. But yes, when you do field studies, you often do need just as many and sometimes more when you're doing it into the lab, because you are giving up some of the control. And so you want to use more subjects to make sure that when you have to toss out some subjects because the recorders didn't work or because they didn't follow the standardized script, and it's really important to follow standardized scripts, you know, it's nice to have those and not have to rerun the data. And if any of these questions, if you have more questions like this, please, I'm not sure I want to answer 120 questions by email, but the answers to a lot of the questions might be in the research that I've done. And if you have this really pressing question, please ask and over email, and I will try to answer. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Mikki. That was excellent. Everybody, if you would join with me in thanking Mikki in the chat there.
You're welcome.
All right. Let's move on to Brian now, and we'll follow the same procedure. So Brian, present for maybe 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, Craig. Not if you can hear me, please. Except your video's off. Mikki, not if you can hear me. There you go. All right, there's actual people two people can hear me, so that's a start. It is 10 p.m. in Hong Kong. I've been up since 4. I've been in bed with the flu for the last 2 days. So if I make any sense at all, this is like miraculous. So I've got some PowerPoint slides as well, and so I'm going to try and get these open. All right. Yeah. So what I want to do is I want to talk about this idea of being very strategic, this idea of novel constructs and novel measures. And because I'm a strategy person, Craig would hold me to this, I'm sure. We have to have a discussion of what does it mean to be strategic. And so there's this great distinction that Michael Porter makes in the corporate strategy literature about the difference between operational effectiveness and strategy. Operational effectiveness is doing the exact same thing as your rivals, but trying to do it a little bit better, okay? So if you've ever been in a coffee shop and you walk in and it looks suspiciously like a Starbucks, right down to the fonts that they use and the colors and the furnishings and that kind of stuff, this is a coffee shop that's competing on operational effectiveness. What Porter says, though, is that strategy is doing things differently. So we're using different sets of resources. We're combining resources in different ways. And what that does is it gives us a unique position, okay? So this is what we want to try. We want to try and focus on in this discussion of novelty. Where do we go looking for novelty? There's another strategy tool called value chain, and it allows us to separate things out into primary and secondary activities. If we were making a good, right, we would be procuring inputs, actually doing the manufacturing processes. Those are primary things. The secondary items are going to be things like marketing, sales, customer support, that type of thing. So what we want to try and do is to try and find a way to make our research have a unique value proposition where you're going to look at that and go, wow, this is unique and it's distinctive. Mikki was talking about some of the things that she does, right? So there's clearly a consistent pattern in the types of designs and questions that she uses. So if you were to look at that, you'd go, wow, this is different and it's really cool. But if we were to think more broadly about this, there's a lot of ways that we can try and differentiate in vis-a-vis the methodology. We can ask different research questions. We can have different types of data. We can construct new measures. We can improve measures. We can do different things with analysis, and we can do some other things with our applications. So there's a tension, right, when you're considering doing different things. We can do the same thing as everyone else, or we can do different things. And this comes down to your risk-return preference. You do the exact same thing as everyone else, which is operational effectiveness or operational excellence. It's easier to justify. A lot of times it's easier to sell to reviewers, but you get less unique insights in there because it's not as novel. On the other hand, if you're going to do something that is really unique and really different, it has the potential for really high impact. One of the downsides is that it can be hard to convince the reviewers because you're doing something differently. And there's also a very real danger when you're doing something like this that you have novelty for novelty's sake. This becomes especially challenging if you are, say, a doctoral student or an early stage assistant prof, right? Most people aren't focused on trying to shape the literature at that point. They're focused on trying to get a publication so that they have something that they can take to an interview and get a first job, and then they're trying to get a few more publications so they can try and get tenure. So you may find that your orientation towards doing higher impactful stuff can change at different points in your career, but it's definitely a consideration that you have to have. I want to give two very different examples of some of these issues about being unique versus being part of the broader herd. And this slide is a look at the use of contingency models in strategic management research. It's based on every paper that was published in SMJ from 1980 up through about 2010 or so. The red line is the total number of articles. The green line is the number of empirical papers. And the blue line are the contingency papers. And for contingencies, we're talking papers that use one of the 6 tools that are described in Venkatraman's 89 AMR that lays out the different primary methodologies for contingency work. So we look at the slide and we go, wow, right? This is encouraging in terms of moving the field forward because contingency questions are more nuanced, and we have seen a steady growth in the use of contingency types of designs from way back in 1980 up to the current day. But if we drill down and we look at the types of contingencies in a little bit more detail, we actually see something very negative is happening here, and that is contingency used to be very rich and varied. And so in the early parts of the strategic management field, folks were using a variety of different conceptual approaches, right? This is the research question part of the value chain to develop these hypotheses. And if we were to look instead at what's happening here, is we see that contingency is becoming almost exclusively, well, maybe half, so I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it is becoming predominantly interaction. So what that means is that the use of contingency types of models in empirical strategy work has actually become less rich less original. And now when people say, hey, let's introduce a contingency in our study, it's just simply, we have an X1, we have an X2, let's multiply them together. So it makes for much less interesting stuff. Second example that I want to give. We look at construct measurement practices, which is a pet peeve of mine. We're showing the results of some content analyses. The one on the left looks at SMJ articles 1988 through 2000, and the one on the right is SMJ single year in 2010. Okay, so what the graph on the left shows us, very disappointingly, is that the overwhelming majority of constructs used in empirical strategy research, reflected by publication in SMJ, are done with single measures. Controls almost invariably with single measures, independent variables, more likely dependent variables, a little less likely, and we'd see more dependent variables being represented with multiple measures. So if we look at that graph on the left, and then we compare that to the graph on the right, we see in the passage of a decade or two is that the field has actually become less varied and moving in a real negative direction. What we see here is the field has actually become more predisposed towards standardizing on single indicator measures. This is really problematic because while they're standardizing on single indicators, they're not standardizing on the same definitions, and so we have very much an apples to orange type of comparison. It's actually apples to guavas and kumquats and all sorts of stuff. So let's take a really basic construct, right? One of the most simple types of constructs that we would have if we were a strategy researcher is firm size. And so when we first started doing these content analyses, we said, well, firm size has got to be a tremendous amount of agreement in what everybody uses. And this pie chart shows the distribution where actually the majority of these studies used number of employees, sales, assets, and there's a huge cluster of the others. And so there's variation, but it's not necessarily novelty in this case. It's just random. So going back to the point of this session, we want to try and cultivate novel constructs and measures. And so I get a lot of methods papers to review where they're introducing a new tool, a new application, a new measure. And a lot of these papers get rejected because most papers get rejected. So a roadmap or a flow chart to help you make a better sales pitch for novel methods. First thing you have to do is you have to demonstrate to the reviewers that the topic is important. That means you have to show that it's salient and there's activity recently. If it's a niche topic or it's a topic with declining interest, the rest is not so interesting. The second thing that you have to do is you have to show us that there's a problem. And this means demonstrate the limitations of the current methodological approaches. Very often I see papers and they use weasel words. They'll say possibly, could lead to, might happen, other types of things like that, which means that they're very speculative. Craig, and I'm at 10 minutes, 18 seconds. I'll be done in about a minute and a half. I'm taking Mickey's 2 minutes that she gave me. That's awesome. Thank you. So your problem can't be speculative. You have to demonstrate that there actually is a problem. And a large number of these methods pieces that I see don't do that. You want to demonstrate inconsistent findings across studies. Look at studies that use different designs, different methodologies. Show us how the results vary systematically as one type of example. You could replicate different approaches and show how results vary that way. And then the next stage is to have a solution. A surprising number of papers that I get to review describe the solution and they don't actually do it. This would be analogous to being a foodie and going into a fancy French restaurant, ordering items after consultation with a knowledgeable waiter and a wine steward, and then having them bring everything out to you and say, oh, no, you can't eat it. You're just looking at it. So you need to actually test your solution versus describing it. But then you also need to demonstrate why this is the better mousetrap. And so a lot of these papers, even if they do test, they don't compare their test with the current alternatives. And so the last thing that you want to do when you're trying to introduce this novel methodological component is you want to say, hey, here's what everybody does. Here's what we're doing. We run the two of them in identical settings, and we demonstrate how you fundamentally changed the conversation. Okay, that's all I got.
Okay, thanks very much, Brian. We'll open that up to questions. So if you have questions for Brian, please put them in the chat. Maybe I'll start with one for you to talk about while we're getting a few of these questions. I wonder to what extent you feel that strategy scholars should be using estimation techniques like SEM that we don't use very often, that are, to my mind, a little better suited to having multiple reflective indicators of constructs.
Well, so we're not any worse off than any other domain of management, Craig. And so, you know, a thing that's fascinating is that everybody gets trained now, or most everybody gets trained now, at least some introduction to SEM. And the SEM statistical tools are so easy. You don't have to write code for parameters. You know, you can just drag constructs in and draw lines between things, and it's become dramatically simpler and easier. But mediation studies are only about 5% of the work in management, and that proportion is pretty similar for strategy studies versus others. And this just underscores the relative lack of use for SEM, both for mediation tests, but also for construct development and measurement types of things. Right? It's a low-hanging fruit where there's a lot of things that you can do that can be pretty innovative, where the technology itself isn't actually all that innovative. I've got a pair of papers with Steve Gove and Mike Hitt that we did back in 2005, and we ran a bunch of analyses in SEM. I actually did it to settle an argument at lunch with someone. We never considered it to be interesting enough to actually do anything with. So I ran it, showed it to somebody at lunch. We put it in a drawer. It sat there for a couple of years. And it turned out later that we got 2 SMJ papers out of it. Okay, we've got some other comments coming up here. So from Anon, we've got a question that says, if we're studying an area that's relatively new and we don't have inconsistent findings to compare questionable evidence, you're trying to set up research. How do we set up the problem without using could lead to possibly or other terms? My criticism for that, Anon, is in studies that will be framed where there is an existing research base, and they are just very speculative as to the nature of the problem. So there might be 10, 20, or 50 studies, but they don't do anything in terms of trying to mine inconsistencies across the studies, how different types of design choices or other things might affect that. So if you've got a new area, the question is a little bit different, and then it becomes, why are we interested in this area? And it could be a geographic area, and we have to make a case of why that is why that's interesting. It could be a content area. Right, and a danger with either one of those is just because we haven't studied it doesn't mean that it's important or we should care. So, for example, replication studies in different geographic regions. If the results are the same as every other geographic replication, it doesn't give us a lot of information. If you're testing an agent that's been validated in a lot of other settings, and the variables are only slightly different from other studies, there's not a lot of new information in there. So the challenge for you with any of these is to be able then to make the claim, this is why theoretically and practically, because business schools are applied, right? We ultimately are about normative practitioner advice. So you have to build that argument of saying, this is why we need to study this topic, because we simply don't understand it. Miles has got a really good question about what are some of the ways you can frame the tension in existing researching methods without throwing prior work under the bus. The last thing that you want to do is to do these really sharp critiques of what other people have done, right? Because, well, partly some of those people are probably going to be reviewing your paper. You know, so I've gotten papers to review, for example, where I read a line and I say to my wife, oh, this is interesting. Read this part. It says, if Boyd et al. Had been more careful. That's really cool. Not everybody takes that really well. I think the challenge is to try and do that in a developmental way of saying, this is what's been done so far. This is what we've learned so far. But then there are different ways to extend that. A lot of it, frankly, is tone, and you don't want to necessarily pander to the previous authors and reviewers. But you can definitely do it in a complimentary way, and you can do it in a hostile way, right? And as a reviewer, I've seen both, and I certainly react better to the more developmental way. Okay, and Craig, just tell me to shut up whenever we run out of questions.
Please keep going.
Okay, so the next question is really long. It says, in testing hypotheses between indicators A and B, would the use of reflective measures based on constructs with good discriminant validity lead to better theory development than the use of formative methods? In other words, if formative measures of a construct may perform differently in terms of convergent validity, could reliance on formative measures of a construct undermine theory development? We're going to need a whole extra session of an hour and a half because there's a lot of cool stuff that's packed in there. So I'm going to risk being flip and take the short answer that somebody like Jeff Edwards would just tell you that formative indicators are a fad and a waste of time, versus other people they're going to say, hey, it is the best thing since sliced cheese. There's a lot of very fundamental differences in the utility of formative models. I think conceptually there's a lot of cases where they would certainly fit and they would be useful. And I know I'm not doing justice to your question because it's got a lot of complicated moving parts to it. But in the interest of parsimony, I think you can sell either one, although you will get some reviewers, right, who are just going to say, hey, I am in this camp where I believe or not believe. That would be hard. Okay, last one. Take firm size as an example. Is it good to add so many firm size variables in the regression model? Although adding controls is not expensive, finance papers tend to have only a few. It's hard to imagine having multiple indicators for most of the variables in the model. And that's from Qingyuan. Yeah, certainly. I'm not saying that you need to build a confirmatory factor model of firm size as a control with seven indicators. But I am saying, why pick employees as the most common metric? I mean, historically, the reason for that is a lot of people in IO Psych who are interested in people, and they chose employees as the metric. Realistically, with a lot of modern businesses, given that they do outsourcing or they're tech-based businesses, the number of employees does not do a good job at capturing the actual magnitude or scope of complexity of the business. So you can use single measures, but you can pick better with your measures. There are multiple papers in ORM that talk about some of the issues with controls, right? Because there's overuse on controls, and so there's a great paper by Carlson and Wu. And there's another paper whose authors are escaping me at the exact moment. But they do a really good job at walking through decision tools for you for optimizing your control variables. Last question, then I'll stop. My thoughts on meta-analysis. It's still a valid approach. Although meta-analytic structural equation modeling is the new next big thing there, along with meta-regression. So you can do really cool, really sophisticated stuff. Being a first mover, getting on these types of buses with methodological innovations allow you to do a lot of interesting things and claim some interesting space. We just published last year the first meta-analytic structural equation model that had been published in SMJ ever, right? And the micro people have been doing this forever, but for the macro people, it's still pretty new. So lots of cool stuff. JMS is working on a special issue on meta-analysis right now, and I expect there to be cool things that'll come out of that. Jim Combs and Russell Crook at Tennessee are working on that. All right, questions are done. I'm going to stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. A few people are starting to say thank you in the chat. If you would join with me in thanking Brian. Brian is also a very humble man. If you ever want a model on the strategy side of how to do construct validity work, new constructs, just pick a random Boyd paper. I've read more of them than I've had hot dinners, and every one of them is excellent. All right, let's hand it over to Anne now. Thanks, Anne.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm just going to find my slides. Thank you for inviting me for this event. It's the first time I've done this, so I'm not sure whether I know the norms, but let's see what happens. So you should now have my PowerPoint. Is that right? In this session, I'm a qualitative researcher, so we're going to do something a little bit different in my presentation here and in our discussion. And I'm particularly going to talk about something which is a constant challenge, actually, in qualitative research, which is related to the demands that are made of qualitative researchers to be new, to be novel. And I think it's possibly a higher bar for qualitative researchers than those who are doing quantitative research, although I think it's there also for all kinds of research. So let me start by just showing you, this is an extract from Bansal and Corley's, from the editor's paper in Academy of Management Journal. It's called The Coming of Age of Qualitative Research. And let me just read to you a couple of quotes from that article. And the first quote is about credibility. So it's about how qualitative research needs to be extremely rigorous. And they say, researchers must show a trail of evidence conveyed not just in the method section, but throughout the paper, such that each element of the paper is logically connected. Methodological rigor is conveyed by describing the who, what, where, when, and how in such a way that the reader sees clearly how the researcher moved from the raw data to the theoretical insight. So what is being said here is that you really do need to, if you're doing a qualitative study, you need to make sure that your theoretical insight, the novelty in the paper, is very, very tightly connected to the data. So this is a basic requirement in the top journals, that you should have a tightly aligned connection between your data and your theory. Now then, let's read the second quote on contribution. A theoretical contribution not only describes or explains a phenomenon, but also discerns or anticipates what scholars need to know about it, and shapes their framing and dialogue around it. It's not just about filling a gap in the literature. It is also about changing the way scholars think and talk about the phenomenon. Last sentence is quite striking. It is also about changing the way scholars think and talk about the phenomena. So essentially what they're saying is it has to change the way you think. And so what you have here is a real tension between, on the one hand, the credibility, and on the other side, the novelty. And if it's really novel, it's going to be quite hard to do that tying up in a bow that is required in the first point. And if it's really tied up in a bow, the chances are that it might be not that novel. So there's this tension here, and I think that these are the requirements that make it quite difficult to do successful qualitative research. You are expected to make some kind of conceptual leap, which will enable us to see something new, and yet this has to be done in such a way that the validity and the credibility of your story is completely perfect. So if we move on, let's look at some examples of what credible novelty might look like. And I've given an example here of Corley and Joya's paper about identity ambiguity in the wake of a corporate spin-off. And this is published in Administrative Science Quarterly. And essentially what this paper does, it introduces a new construct which has not been developed in the literature so far. It's called identity ambiguity. And it's a phenomenon that occurs when you have a spin-off. So a spin-off is when a part of a firm is taken away from the main firm, and so there's a new identity needs to be developed. And they developed this model of how a spin-off develops a new identity, and they introduced this concept of identity ambiguity. And the way that they do this, and those of you who have been looking at qualitative research recently will have seen the type of work that they do. They present what they call a data structure. And essentially what a data structure does is it shows you in detail how the author moved from first order codes, that is codes that were grounded in the data, to more abstract level themes, and then to main dimensions, the main constructs, to produce the key novel phenomena. And they document this in a logical process, and you can really see how the micro level data codes up to the abstract constructs and arrives at an integrated theory. And so this kind of work looks absolutely wonderful. There is novelty here, and you can really see the credible steps that researchers go through. And so that's wonderful. That's what it looks like. But what we don't know is actually, and which is always the mysterious part, is how actually they got there. And Denny Joya has talked about a phenomenon that he calls the Shazam, which is the conceptual leap, which is the piece between the data and this construct that's there, that came out of it, because in actual fact, when you actually have a database of qualitative data, it's not sort of sitting there waiting for the codes that you're going to put on it that will take you to this original concept. There isn't any mechanical way to code data that will guarantee such a result. At least I've never found it, and I don't think other scholars have found it also. When we read really good papers, what we're reading is the result of a creative process, but it's not showing us the creative process, and it cannot. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit, and this is based on a paper that Malvina Clark and I wrote for the International Journal of Management Reviews on approaching the conceptual leap in qualitative research. And what we suggest is that actually it's a dialectical process. And it's a dialectical process which requires more than just systematically analyzing data. And so we have basically 4 tensions in this diagram here. And one of them, maybe the top 4, starting with knowing, going up to social connection, are more deliberative kinds of things, and the ones at the bottom are more creative kinds of things. So the top ones are more disciplined, and the bottom ones are more undisciplined. And so you need both. Our argument is that you need both. So of course you need to code data, but you're going to do it again and again and again. And coding data does not guarantee your result, and you will often find, those of you who have experience in coding qualitative data, is you can get lost in codes. So from time to time, you need to detach from them, go for a walk, do something else. Take a step back from your data. Similarly, there are a number of heuristics that you can use to think about ways to analyze your data, to think about ways to deliberately find paths to novelty. But on the other hand, many people who have had brilliant ideas in their research often say that there's a huge amount of chance involved, so it's a serendipity end. Some people think that you can develop ideas from your own experience, but not having experience and being naive can also be a positive thing. So these are these dialectics. If I go to my final slide, I've just written down some of the things that I think that can help us get to credible novelty, and drawing on the notion that Carl Weick put forward of disciplined imagination. And on the left side, you have the disciplined part, and on the right side, you have the imagination part. So in the disciplined part, there's the coding and the memoing and the more coding that we all do when we're looking at qualitative data. But on the right side, there's the detaching that we need in order to get the creative juices going. On the left side, we have reading the prior literature in your field, but a lot of qualitative researchers think that that might actually narrow down your focus. So reading outside the field, looking at other things may help you arrive at something new. In a more disciplined approach, tabulating your data, drawing grids. Miles and Huberman suggest a large number of ways of doing that can be useful. I have personally found, however, that trying to draw your data, not just tabulating it, but trying to draw it, may give you some more interesting ideas. Talking to informed insiders is a more disciplined way of working. But in order to get new ideas, you may need to talk to naive outsiders. And then there are a series of heuristics, ways of questioning your data. So things like looking at your data and asking what, how, why, who, when, where. These are basic heuristics that people use to look at data. Concepts, looking at concepts according to the 6 C's, which is Strauss's approach to qualitative data. I even wrote a paper in 1979 about strategies for theorizing from process data, and I have a list of 7 strategies. You can go through them and see what you can get out of that. And on the right, I put something which I have always found to be an extremely useful thing for getting the creative juices flowing, and that is presenting at a conference. Having to give a 10-minute PowerPoint presentation about your qualitative data, even when it's not ready, is a wonderful way of getting ideas and producing that novelty. Of course, you then have to go back and do the coding and the memoing and the coding so that the final product looks like the kinds of fantastic, credible novelty type papers that we see published in our journals. So there's some ideas. I invite you to read the paper by Clegg and Langley about conceptual leaping. There's some interesting examples in there. And that's what I wanted to say. I'd be ready for your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne. That was great. Oh, so everybody, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll be able to address those. While people are writing those, I did have one for you, Anne. You mentioned Denny Joyer. I was lucky enough to study under him at Penn State, as Tim Quigley did. Among many of Denny's great terms, he has the idea of foreshadowing that he talks about. He talks about introducing a new idea or a concept kind of early on in the paper. And so people they're prepared for it, they're mentally ready by the time they discover it in the results. How do you try to do that in your own work? How do you see that idea of foreshadowing?
In my own writing, I have tried all kinds of ways. I think that there is a sort of tension here. With inductive work, the theoretical contribution emerges at the end in real time. However, it's very hard for readers to keep track of that emergent process. So it is a very useful thing to actually foreshadow it up front. And I usually do that in many of my studies up to a point. Some of the ways of doing it might be to give some basic ideas about what's going to emerge and then allow the rest to develop. Unfortunately, I think what tends to happen is that whichever way you write it the first time when you submit it to a journal, the reviewers will prefer something else. So if you foreshadow too much, the reviewers may feel that it looks as if your paper is deductive, that you started with the theory and that you're just verifying it. And so they will ask you to do it a different way. But I mean, personally, it is extremely helpful to write it that way, and many of my papers do actually start with a model.
Okay, great. Thanks.
At the beginning of the findings section. I'm trying to find the chat.
So we have, so if you go down to the bottom of the screen, there's a chat button.
Just a minute. Okay.
The first question is from Jen Faitosa. It's the one that says, what are your thoughts about the coding with software? For example, NVivo, Luke, etc. Do you have any preference?
Yeah, I think I've used Atlas TI quite a lot, and I've also used NVivo. I think that they are useful, but they don't do the job for you. I mean, the most important thing to realize is that there is no software that will actually do it for you. The software, the only thing it will do is help you organize your data. And the software tends to favor certain types of coding. So you use NVivo, it favors a kind of hierarchical type of coding where you have categories that build up to other categories that build up to other categories. Sometimes I do coding which is like story coding. So I will take, for example, an interview and I will try to frame it into what happened first, then what happened next, and then what happened next, and then what happened next. The software are not very useful for that. You have to do. I quite often use Word for those kinds of things. In terms of LIWC, which I think is more like a text analysis software for word counting and so on. I haven't used that. I think that that's very useful if you want to do some systematic counting of words and so on. This is not my preference, but so yes, use the software to help you organize, but realize that it's not going to do things for you. I see I have another question here. So is novelty, thank you, Sri, is novelty in some sense close to the roots of grounded theory, whereas credibility comes from joining a conversation? Novelty is indeed close to the roots of grounded theory. Credibility comes from joining a conversation in the sense that you do need to connect your work to other literature, but it also comes from the care with which you are able to show the findings in your data. One of the real problems with a lot of qualitative research papers you see is that it claims to be grounded theory, and there is indeed data, and there is indeed theory, but the connection between the two is very weak. And so the credibility comes really from connecting the two in a very strong way. And that's why it's actually difficult. The novelty is also difficult too, because you have to rise above. You need to rise above the data in order to achieve some kind of novelty, and yet you need to be deeply grounded in it. And I've always found that tension a little bit difficult to handle, but I think that's what the journals are now requiring from us. Mixed methods research. I have tried it a few times, and I have never found it particularly satisfactory. And I think the reason is I can see there's some interest in doing, for example, a thesis with a quantitative chapter and a qualitative chapter, and keeping them separate, but sort of them speaking to the same issue. I know some people who do mixed methods very well. Some of Kim Emsbach's work I admire very much. But in my experience, it's very hard to mix qualitative and quantitative methods and do it well. And the reason is that each kind of method requires certain specialization, and you have to do it according to the norms of the field. And to do both within the same academic paper is just too much. The qualitative part seems to be slightly polluted sometimes by the quantitative part. The two have different assumptions. They don't mix all that well. And a little bit of qualitative data to support a quantitative study is not that convincing either. So I would tend to say fine, but keep them separate. That's my view. Others might disagree. Thank you, Senior, for that one. Then Arjit, when I say drawing data, yes, very much trying to map the constructs. A number of things you can draw a number of things with qualitative data. One of the things that I try to draw, because I'm very interested in process research and how things evolve over time, is I try to draw a flow diagram. So what happened before what? So that you would look at their temporal connectedness of events, for example. And so when you do that, you might have boxes and arrows, but you might have actually quite a bit of text, quite a bit of data in the boxes and the arrows as you're drawing them. Another kind of map might look at relationships between people that you are seeing in your data. So that might be another way to draw. And I mean, it's hard to foresee these things. I mean, what I would like to do at some point is write a paper about drawing data, because I usually find when I'm working with students and working with colleagues that I doodle, and that some of the doodles that come up from discussing the data are helpful in seeing, getting insight from that. And if you read any of my papers, you'll probably find it's got drawings. They've got drawings in them, which help understand the data. Next question. In introducing new theoretical construct, will PhD students face the liability of newness? How to overcome it? Or should we rather leave it to senior scholars? Thank you. Yes. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the liability of newness, but possibly you mean that people don't like to see new constructs. They will try and they will suggest that it's very similar to another construct, and don't like you to have new labels. I think there is a liability of newness. I have this frustration myself, trying to introduce new constructs. And sometimes I've had the feeling that people would rather not have them, but I don't think it's a privilege of senior scholars to introduce new constructs. I think senior scholars get shot down with those just as much. But what I think I would suggest is, if you have a new construct, you really do need to show, A, how it is grounded deeply in the data, and B, how it is different from previous constructs. So you do need to map the field and have the data which really supports it. I have the feeling that possibly you have a personal experience underlying this question, and if you would like to send me an email about your personal experience, that's fine too. Which is more precise rather than a general question. Next one, qualitative research often involves rich data with several interesting concepts in the interplay. What strategies or tactics do I use to carve out the key theoretical idea in the paper? Well, that's a hard one. I mean, I think I have my own personal preference in the way I look at data. I will try several things. I will try a little bit of in vivo coding, so I will just get into it and see what pops out when I try to look at it carefully. One tactic I usually use is to ask myself how this story or the data can be broken down into temporal phases. I've always found that to be helpful in getting me to theorize about what's going on in the paper. And the strategy of drawing also is something that I use to try and see what's going on. And I think that it's as I mentioned, it's a dialectic process, so that there is the bottom-up side where you're working hard on the data, and there's the top-down side where you step back and try and see above it. And you need to have both. This is the key thing. When I see a student a little bit bogged down in their data, I always ask them to make me a PowerPoint, because I find that that's a 10-minute PowerPoint, because I find that then the conversation starts to change and more comes through. Coming back to the question about publishing qualitative and quantitative inquiry, what about the research question? Should we also present the last research question, given that it's also changed along the way? Yes. I think that yes. I don't think in academic papers people are not really interested in knowing your stream of consciousness from your first research question to where you ended up. So you do need to present the last research question while admitting that it emerged as through the process. But I wouldn't go right back to the beginning and show the evolution of your research question. I don't think that would be helpful. Maybe we want to hand over so that we can have some questions for everyone. Or wait, there's one more.
Yeah, there is. Sorry, I'll let you answer that last one.
Okay, on a technical note, what would be some of the guides, videos that you would recommend for using in vivo, especially for the analysis part once the coding is done? I couldn't answer that question. I'm not someone who has looked at those guides and videos. I mean, NVivo is very good at promoting their software. I'm sure that you could find on the website, on their website, some suggestions about this. So probably I'm not the best person to answer that question.
Okay, that was excellent. Thank you very much, Anne. And I'd like to ask everybody to join with me in thanking Anne for taking the time to instruct us today. I want to thank the three presenters, Mikki, Brian, and Anne, especially for being both comprehensive and efficient. We have 5 minutes to go, so we can finish up early if you like. If anybody has any additional questions that you were thinking about while the three presenters were going, anything that you didn't have the chance to ask, I'll wait for a couple of seconds to see if anything comes through. Okay, it looks like we're done. Nobody has ever complained about finishing a session early, so we will finish the session early. And thanks again to our three awesome presenters. And for the rest of you, we'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.